Most people say Final Fantasy XIII is a disappointment. It follows what many hail as a high point for the long-running franchise, Final Fantasy XII, and the wait for 13 proved too long for the feverish expectations of one more trip into the world's best-loved JRPG. Complaints sounded from all corners, protesting to the linear fashion of the game, the boring characters, the battle system that was a pale imitation of former systems, and the lack of any side quests or villagers to talk to. Veterans of the world of Final Fantasy felt betrayed by the game, and it was left to drown in criticism, struggling to win any praise or approval. I say Final Fantasy XIII is a breath of fresh air. Maybe my hand is the only one reaching to pull 13 from its watery grave, maybe my words are the only giving it life, but I found a game I feel deserving of more recognition in spite of flaws. I find a game so brave and daring in an age of reruns and rehashes in the gaming industry. To begin with, it isn't perfect. I won't make any effort to claim it is. What I want to do is give a taste to those who, like me, were curious, but let the voice of the people kill that curiosity. I won't go into great detail on the visual identity of this game, as all reviews, good or bad, have accepted that the game is beautiful. The best comparison to draw of the visual impact of Final Fantasy XIII is to the recent James Cameron movie Avatar. In many ways, 13 does what Avatar did for cinema, delivering many whoa moments throughout its lengthy campaign and spoiling the eyes with the best damn hair tech you'll ever see in a game. The story makes assumptions you know more than you actually do, as well as making itself out to be more meaningful or deeper than it actually is. At its core, it's a straightforward story, intertwined with surprisingly effective character side stories and one of the more convincing romances in recent gaming. It's JRPG and what anyone would come to expect of a game in that genre. What sets it apart is the genuine purpose of each character within the interlocking story, and their driving forces progress being logical and much more human than we're used to seeing in gaming. With each having unique personalities that can lead to moments of weakness, but flawed, noble intentions, making for very believable characters in spite of initial impressions. A major problem highlighted almost universally is that of narrow linear areas progressing only to more narrow linear areas. While I will not lie and say there's much more to 13 than linear areas and fighting monsters, it isn't as bad as many would have you believe. As you travel from point A to B, areas do indeed rarely open up to branching paths, and quite often feel like elaborately decorated corridors. While this is a valid point of contention, it's clear this isn't a design choice brought about by laziness or limitation, but more so one governed by design choice. There is a rhythm to the variation of areas, and you never spend too long in any one area in particular, and have a rewarding sense of progression as areas become wider and more open as the game counts through its hours. Final Fantasy XIII is a streamlined game. It's Final Fantasy, but it's squeezed and beaten to a pulp by the pressure of critical gamers and sieved, poured into a glass, refreshing, cool, and containing all the vital elements of its previous form. Cries for innovation and new life in long-running franchises is ever present. Gamers always keen to make their voices heard when enough is enough, and the tolerance for developer-comfortable entries to a series have outstayed their welcome. The Legend of Zelda is one such franchise, defining a generation, but only toying stubbornly within that same space for each entry since, coming to an ugly conclusion in 2008's Twilight Princess, a game that perhaps defines the now repetitive nature of the series. Final Fantasy XIII, by comparison, is perhaps everything you might ask for in terms of a brave new design choices and interesting new directions to innovate a franchise. It's the best example in recent memory of modernizing a franchise, good or bad. It definitely has that new car smell. And this is a good thing, this is a great thing. It isn't something the game should be criticized for. There is no fluff or excess, the pace itself is more alike to a marathon, a steady speed and a steady progression, as opposed to entries in the series in the past which could be described as leisurely strolls, occasionally racing into heart-pounding danger. A similar approach to game design was recently applied to both Mass Effect 2 and Dragon Age 2. Mass Effect 2 choosing to take away the cumbersome inventory system of the first game and replace it with a preset selection of weapons, awarding players a choice to choose from each as the game progressed. While debated by many to be a fault or a blessing, inventory systems are nevertheless a design element from the past. They can also be a barrier that stops gamers from enjoying an experience. Many gamers are lifetime veterans of the hobby, with menu systems, managing and spending experience points, and juggling inventory items coming as second nature to us. But many more don't play games because there's no effort made to introduce new players to these complex elements. Where does the guy get on board with Final Fantasy when it's got so much micromanagement, expanded lore, and not so rookie friendly battle system? The answer is Final Fantasy XIII. While the game does indeed have an inventory system, and a relatively needy one at that, far more effort is made to help players understand the effects of that customization. As well as that, leveling up characters is quite literally branched into experience trees, as well as an optimization feature built within the inventory system, which will allow players to equip the best combination of items for their selected character. There is, of course, with that, a persistent element of hand-holding throughout the game, both in its inventory systems, its battle systems, its overall menu system. This helps new players to ease into the ways of Final Fantasy, and really teach them to understand the cause and effect of its many features. This, of course, could be seen as a flaw of the game rather than a positive, but I feel personally this is the first Final Fantasy game 100% committed to introducing new players to the long-running franchise. Perhaps there is no call for innovation within Final Fantasy. Perhaps it's entirely unique in its immunity to becoming stale and tedious. Perhaps the gamers who play Final Fantasy, who've enjoyed Final Fantasy for years and years, perhaps they don't need it. Perhaps they want the game to be the same as it's always been. Perhaps they didn't expect the developers to try something new. Maybe there is so much hatred for 13 because it's the Wind Waker of Final Fantasies. It's different, and it's innovative, and it's fresh, but maybe all before the franchise needed it. Maybe it's everything Final Fantasy will need in the future, but that it doesn't need now. Final Fantasy XIII is not a bad game in any stretch of the imagination, and its dynamic, timing-based battle system, its overly visually delightful presentation, and its long, winding story will give you more than enough value for your money. Once you get past that bottleneck approach to the design, the game will expand and become vast before you. Like all good JRPGs, the game rewards you as you learn how to play it and you become better at playing it. In closing, I would like to admit that perhaps my enjoyment of Final Fantasy XIII comes so easily to me because I'm not a huge veteran of the franchise. I have 1 or 2 Final Fantasy games under my belt, but certainly not the majority of them. I've said before that I feel Final Fantasy XIII is a Final Fantasy game made to introduce new players to Final Fantasy. I stand by that as I feel welcomed with Final Fantasy XIII more than I ever have with previous entries to the series, and I feel that its modern approach is exactly what the franchise needed for me to be a fan. I fully acknowledge that it's a long-running franchise and that it has many thousands of fans who have expectations of the game in the same way that I would have expectations of a Legend of Zelda title. However, I urge them to try it again. Try play Final Fantasy XIII again. Try to see past making comparisons to other entries and judge the game on its own merits as its own game. And also, for anyone who isn't familiar, there's a character who has an afro that has a chocobo chick that lives inside the afro. Now if that isn't worth £12 of your well-earned money, I don't know what is.